Starting the recording. I'm starting the recording. USA history. USA history. This is going to be recorded. I'm not going to put it on the YouTube video. This is why you trim later. But I could have. Maybe I will. I'll think about it. Walker. Aiden. John. Thank you. Chapter 28, The Progressive Era, live edition. So if you hear my annoying first block say anything or laugh at my hilarious jokes, that's why. The Progressive Era. So the progressive movement is a movement that occurs in the beginning of the 1900s, which used government to improve human welfare, fight monopolies, corruption, inefficiency, social justice, and you can also read that. Henry Damaris Lloyd slammed the Standard Oil Company with his book Wealth Against Commonwealth. Jacob A. Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, which pictured horrific tenement living conditions. All of these issues and all of these people wrote hoping that the government would push against the problems that our nation had in order to bring quote, progress to America. In other words, we wanted to help out the common man against the businessmen and corrupt politicians that had been controlling us. Also, women were able to push for some of their rights, finally the right to vote. We'll get to that later. So what are muckrakers? Muckrakers are people who helped start the progressive era because they wrote about the problems that they saw. Now, initially, this phrase is a derogatory term coined by Teddy Roosevelt because he thought that they would write about the problems of society, government, businesses, but they never really said how we could go about fixing it. Over time, however, writing of people of like Steffens and Tarbell and Adams below, they were able to bring about changes because of their writings, because they finally started pushing for change rather than just making money off the stories they wrote. So you've already done an activity over Lincoln Steffens' Shame of the Cities, but he points out that dogs and dead people were voting in Philadelphia. The fact that the people who lived in that city were basically disenfranchised because of political corruption. Tarbell points out the evils of the Standard Oil Company that was owned and run by Rockefeller. And what she did is she wrote a 9-part expose which completely changed how people viewed Rockefeller because of his evil business practices. Then you have Samuel Hopkins Adams, who pointed out that the medicines, or what they called potions back then, did not exactly have the ingredients you expected. Rather than giving you anything that would make you better, instead they had opiates, alcohol, and maybe sometimes even some cocaine in those potions to make you feel better, but didn't actually help you. So his writings helped bring about a push to change the drug industry. So then you have political progressivism. One major theme of the progressive era is bringing political rights back to the people instead of allowing politicians and businessmen to control it. So these pushes are mainly done by middle-class men and women seeking state control over trusts. Now, really quickly, you do need to know the word trust. It's basically a synonym for very large businesses. There's a specific definition, but for now, just think about monopolies and people like John D. Rockefeller building massive businesses that controlled entire industries. And then number two, the other thing they also tried to change is the living and working conditions for the common man. Furthermore, they wanted to regain political power taken from the people by the interests, in other words, powerful businessmen bribing and controlling congressional votes. And that was all that happened in the Gilded Age. So the laws that they create to bring power back to the people. First, you have the initiative, where voters don't have to wait for politicians to pass laws. Rather, they simply create a petition, and once enough people sign it, it actually is allowed to be voted upon. So that's an initiative. The opposite is the referendum, where, again, they don't have to go through legislators, but they're able to remove laws. Rather than create a law, they remove a law that politicians have passed that people don't like. And the recall is where you can remove an elected official who's not doing a good job. The most famous example in modern America is Arnold Schwarzenegger winning a recall election after the previous governor simply did not do a very good job. And you have the 17th Amendment. So previously, the state legislature would select who would go to the United States Senate for each state. In other words, it was out of the hands of the common man once they chose their state legislature. This instead allows Americans to directly elect the U.S. senator coming from their state. Some specific names of people who were leaders during this time period. Robert La Follette is a big name. He pushes for those political changes we just discussed. And he is probably, other than Teddy Roosevelt, one of the most famous progressive reformers who brings about changes in America. Hiram Johnson breaks the power of the Southern Pacific Railroad over in California, where they had controlled their legislatures and their lawmaking. And then women also organized to begin pushing not only for their voting rights, but also for them to have their working place protections put into practice. And Florence Kelley is one of those main women who used female consumers to pressure for laws safeguarding women and children in the workplace. So Kelley kind of represents the growing feminist movement in the early 1900s that would push towards women's right to vote as well. So now for the key figure of the early progressive era, that is Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed in progressive reform from the early days of his time as a politician. He was always fighting against political corruption. So when he earns re-election, his phrase that he used in 1904 is he wanted a square deal for all Americans. In other words, everyone would come to the table and have an equal share in how the government was run. So the three major parts to his square deal was first, control of corporations, number two, consumer protection, and number three, conservation of natural resources. And surprise, I will have specific examples for each one of those three C's of the square deal. First, we have the very first time that a president takes a stand for the workers instead of businessmen. In the anthracite coal mine strike of 1902, the people who owned the coal mine threatened to threatened basically to break the miners who were on strike by bringing in strike breakers. They didn't really care what happened to the people living in the area around the anthracite coal mine strike. And as winter was coming, there was a worry that not only children in schools would be shut down, but people would not have enough coal to take care of their families throughout the winter. So since Teddy Roosevelt viewed this as an abuse of their power over the coal mine, as well as not really helping out their workers, Teddy Roosevelt threatens to operate the mines with federal troops if the mine owner did not negotiate with the workers. So why this is such a significant moment is if you look at the Pullman, Homestead, and Great Railroad strikes, the president or the government as a whole would side with employers. This is the first time we see the government side with workers instead of siding with the business owner. So this led to the growth of unions and the strengthening of unions throughout the progressive era. And Samuel Gompers himself calls this coal mine strike the, quote, Magna Carta of the labor movement. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt is also known for controlling corporations, not just for workers, but also making sure that some of their worst abuses are reined in as well. The ICC, created in 1887, had not done enough to rein in the railroads and their abusive rates and rebates. So in 1903, under Teddy Roosevelt, Congress passes the Elkins Act, which fines railroads that gave rebates to powerful businesses. In 1906, the Hepburn Act restricted free passes that they would give out to people that were beneficial to their business, but not to a regular person. They also expand the ICC. But probably the biggest moment that earns Teddy Roosevelt the nickname Trust Buster is when he challenges the Northern Securities Company. So this is where we had several railroads in the Northwest who agree and basically form a pool under J.P. Morgan and his business, where they will charge exorbitant or ridiculously high rates to everyone. That way, every single rail makes a lot of money. So when Teddy Roosevelt sees that this is a violation of the previous Sherman Antitrust Act and what the ICC had set for them, he goes about filing a lawsuit against them. Now, J.P. Morgan actually approaches Teddy Roosevelt to try to fix it like he had with other politicians, but Teddy Roosevelt refuses to negotiate because he sees this as extremely abusive. And so finally, the Northern Securities Company versus United States is a massive Supreme Court case which forces the business to dissolve and is one of the very first successes of the working class and progressive era politicians over big business. So now we reach the, excuse me, water. No, I'm not slurping. Sorry, this is live. American meats were dangerous for our people to consume. In fact, they were so dangerous because we had no regulation that foreign nations threatened to ban all U.S. imports. Now, today you would see that we try to ban other countries' food because it's dangerous. But as we were the rising industrial power in the early 1900s, we were the one that was viewed as dangerous to others. So the first person to really write and create a stir about these terrible conditions is a guy named Upton Sinclair. He writes his book, The Jungle. The interesting thing about Sinclair's investigation is that it's actually more of a fictional work with some research done to point out how bad the working conditions in these factories were. But because his story brought light to so much disgusting things going on in those factories, people that read it could care less about the workers who were suffering and cared more about what exactly they were eating. Roosevelt himself, after reading The Jungle, decides that he wants a congressional investigation launched. What they find is absolutely disgusting. And so the meatpacking industry is forced to be overhauled. They have to bring in new practices which kept the meat safe and cleaner and was not going to be shipped out rotten with rope and rat stuff in it. Anyways, it was disgusting. You'll read about it later. And this leads to the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. And then this wave of reform for the meatpacking industry also goes across the entire food industry and, of course, as mentioned earlier, the drug industry as well. So these two acts, the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, prevent the adulteration and mislabeling of food and pharmaceuticals. But most of all, it protects us as consumers from greedy businessmen who could care less what their products did to us as long as they were making money. And then the third C that Roosevelt is known for is conservation. As a child, he had always loved the wilderness. When he was 9 years old, he tried to write a book about the ants in his backyard. He had actually wanted to be a natural scientist, but he knew that there was simply not a very good career there for him. So he had always pursued conservation, and as president, he continued to build on some of the conservation that had already existed. Desert Land Act, Forest Reserve Act, Ferry Act, other acts I'll never ask you about again. Roosevelt passes the Newlands Act of 1902, and what this does is it provides federal funds from the sale of public lands to pay for irrigation projects. In other words, to take care of the land that we already had, we would use a public funding. But probably the biggest thing for his conservation effort is the creation of the U.S. Park Service and setting aside nearly 230 million acres of land through his national parks and forest reserves. Many of these national parks are still some of the largest national parks or parks in the world because he created protection for them. Now, his idea behind this is a term called conservation. Now, you have to understand that it's different from preservation. Some environmentalists want to preserve nature without allowing humans to touch it at all. However, what Roosevelt wanted was the sustainable use of forests, bodies of water, and land. If we did not use our resources, then we would be hindering ourselves. But we wanted to make sure that we would be able to use these forests, water, and land and resources over several generations. That's a key part of conservation. It's not that you're saving that land forever to sit there untouched and unused. It's that you want it to be sustainable. You don't want to use it up very quickly, as many greedy businessmen would have if we had given, say, lumber companies access to those lands. So, again, you have consumer protection, you have control of corporations, and you have conservation. So make sure that you can describe those three major tenets of his presidency. So then you have the Roosevelt Panic of 1907. So Roosevelt had no plans on running for a third term. He was reelected in 1904, but he said that he would honor the two-term tradition begun by George Washington. The Panic of 1907 helped solidify that decision rather, because this short economic downturn resulted in financial reforms. But as president, he didn't want to go through another financial panic. 1908, Congress reacts by passing some other things to help with banks. But the big thing is that Roosevelt decides to step out of the presidential spotlight. And he chooses one of his good friends, William Howard Taft, who had been the ambassador or the person who was running the Philippines at one point. And Taft is able to defeat poor William Jennings Bryan for the third time. In other words, Bryan is basically the modern Henry Clay. But Taft becomes president through Teddy Roosevelt's endorsement. So Teddy Roosevelt's presidency, as we look back at it, is remembered for enlarging the power of the presidential office. And that's because he wanted to use the government for the common good, whereas previous presidents before him believed in laissez-faire and that the government should not really be involved. Teddy Roosevelt, because of this political action as president, helped shape the progressive movement and also opened the eyes of Americans to the fact through his big stick diplomacy that we shared the world with other nations and that we would probably bully them. So that brings us to Taft. I like that it calls him a round peg in a square hole because he was rather round. In fact, our largest president we've had. The stories about him getting stuck in a bathtub are not true. They actually just had to replace the bathtub because he was uncomfortable in it. It's funny to think about a president getting stuck in a bathtub, but simply, it's false. Fake news. President Taft was not as adept of a political leader as Teddy Roosevelt. He adopted an attitude of passivity towards Congress. In other words, he was more of a rubber stamp president than Roosevelt would have ever been. Now, he didn't approve everything that Republican leaders wanted him to do, but he was much more likely to go along with their plans. And you know that because initially, when he was running for president, he said that he wanted to lower tariff and he promised to do so. But what happens once Congress gets a hold of the bill that he was pushing for, they end up raising the tariff. Now, if you're representing the common man, tariffs would only cause the cost of goods to go up. And so this is how you know that he was not as strong of a leader as Teddy Roosevelt, because Teddy Roosevelt would have never approved something that he felt hurt the common people. So with this tariff, the Republican Party begins to split. And progressives get angry that their previous president, Teddy Roosevelt, was no longer in control because Taft wasn't able to stop big business. Speaking of big business, Taft also worked with Wall Street bankers and other businessmen to invest in foreign areas. So, whereas Teddy Roosevelt used the military to intimidate and get our way in foreign affairs, Taft was willing to use our money to do that. And so, his diplomacy is often called dollar diplomacy, where we would use our money to strengthen American defenses and foreign policies, and we would bring prosperity back. Now, this unfortunately would lead to us controlling a lot of Latin American countries. We would establish banks and help them in their financial system. Once they did something that did not benefit the United States, we would send the military to intervene on our behalf. So you can understand why they would not like that because, well, if we're supposed to be helping them, why are we bringing only money back to our country? And why are we basically manipulating them? Well, that's imperialism for you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. Japan and Russia controlled the railroads in China's Manchuria area, and so Taft also gives a large loan to China in order to build those railroads. So you can see him trying to use our money to bring some benefits to other nations, but also to improve our own economic fortunes. So the funny thing about Roosevelt being called the trust buster is that Roosevelt had much fewer attempts at trusting or busting the trust or busting up big business during his presidency. Taft instead brought 90 lawsuits against trusts during his 4 years, whereas Roosevelt only had 44 in 7 years. So in 1911, when the Supreme Court ordered the dissolution of the Standard Oil Company, claiming it violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, Taft was a big part of pushing for that to occur. The Supreme Court also laid out its rule of reason doctrine, that a trust should only be illegal if it was unreasonably restraining trade. That's why in today's modern America, you have groups like Apple and Google dominating entire industries. But as long as they're not actively restraining their competitors, then they are allowed to continue functioning. So that is a key finding during Taft's presidency that we continue to apply today. But note that he continues the trend of busting trust during his presidency. Let's talk about why Taft was not as good of a president in Republican and progressives' eyes as Teddy Roosevelt. Taft had already begun to split the party through that aforementioned tariff, which he had called it the best bill. That sounds a very Trumpy thing to say. In 1909, he also tarnished his conservationist record. He fired a very good friend of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the Division of Forestry. When he fires this guy, he replaces him with someone who did not respect those conservationist goals as well. So people began calling for Roosevelt to intervene because of these mistakes. So when Taft continues doing these things, Roosevelt, being the kind of attention-seeking person he just naturally was, decides that he will actually return to run against Taft for the Republican nomination. Now, you can understand why Republican leaders would not want Teddy Roosevelt to return, because he refused to listen to them and actively hindered big business at the expense, or rather helped the common man at the expense of big business. So even though Teddy Roosevelt wins more states in the primary, when it comes to national nominating convention, the Republican leaders select Taft because they know they can control him better than Teddy Roosevelt. So normally today you would see the candidate step down and just kind of stop running. Teddy Roosevelt instead decides to run his own political campaign as a third-party candidate. His party became known as the Progressive Party, but the most common name that you'll hear is when it's called the Bull Moose Party. So Roosevelt runs as a third-party candidate for the Progressive Party and for all those who wanted much more radical platforms. So what's interesting is Roosevelt was extremely radical in this. He wanted rights for women to vote. Now, that doesn't sound that radical, but he also wanted things like national health care, some very radical ideas that for their time were something that we wouldn't see instituted for nearly a century. He called this new nationalism, which supported stronger control of trust, women's suffrage, and many other social welfare programs. Meanwhile, as Roosevelt and Taft are busy splitting the Republican Party, Democrats choose Woodrow Wilson, an Ivy League president, who was seen as a reformist leader who could beat Taft in a national election because of his strong background. Democrats had a strong progressive platform as well. In fact, you'll often see a comparison between a new nationalism and new freedom. New freedom is what Wilson called his plans. The three major ideas behind Wilson's program was that he called for stronger antitrust laws, he promised to reform the banking system, and he also promised a tariff reduction. So what's interesting is Roosevelt and Wilson actually have very similar platforms. And even though Roosevelt would be considered more of a conservative, he actually had the more radical social welfare programs as well. So both of them favored a more active role in economic and social affairs, but disagreed over specific strategies of how to implement it. Now, what you may be wondering here is who's going to win this election? Roosevelt was extremely popular, but the problem is that traditional Republicans and businessmen refused to support Roosevelt over Taft. And that is why Woodrow Wilson is able to win the election despite only winning 42% of the votes. So Roosevelt splits the Republican and progressive votes between himself and Taft, and Wilson is able to win the election. So Wilson will be the one who carries out the rest of the progressive reforms throughout the progressive era, which will end once World War I begins. But the theme of controlling big business and reining it in for the benefit of the common man continues. So that wraps up our live version of chapter 28. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you. Only about 3 or 4 students were seen on their phones. I think that's pretty impressive. Najee Walker, someone else out there, I forget who else. Hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day. Was it Aiden on his? Unacceptable. Yes, John, go ahead.